Good morning, friends from Bristol Road Baptist Church. Once again, I'm here to bring you another message from God's Word, hoping it will be a blessing and encouragement to you as we continue in these unprecedented days of the coronavirus lockdown. It's good to be with you, and I trust that you're all keeping safe and well, and be assured of my prayers. And I look forward, like I'm sure you do, to the day when we can all meet together again back in church. But until then, let's look at God's Word together. Now, this weekend is a special weekend. It's the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Back on May the 8th in 1945, the Allied forces accepted the unconditional surrender of the German military forces and brought to an end that terrible war that had ravaged Europe. And it's good that we take part in these celebrations, though some would argue the fact. I think it's right that we give thanks and celebrate that wonderful generation that gave up so much that we might appreciate and enjoy the freedom and liberties that we have today. And with that in mind, I understand that for some people, when Christians use militaristic language, it can be offensive, and I can understand why it's being reviewed in a sense. And particularly when we use militaristic language when we talk about crusades, etc. However, the Old Testament is strewn with military events, and although the New Testament chooses to use moral argument rather than military campaigns to express truth, we do see in the New Testament numerous times when analogies are used regarding militaristic ideas to put across the fact that we're engaged in a great spiritual conflict. And so I think it's only right that we use militaristic terms when we're comparing our spiritual battle with ordinary warfare. I mean, for instance, the Apostle Paul, when he wrote to the church in Ephesus, said this: "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." And so with this in mind this morning, I'd like to take a short time to have a look at the wonderful spiritual power that can be unleashed when we serve together, if you like, as soldiers of Christ. I want to begin by looking at a familiar term. It'll be familiar to some, maybe not to others. Military history, for instance, teaches us that though some soldiers may fight for a cause or a flag or a country, most of them, if you ask them, will tell you when they were fighting for their oppos, their buddies, their fellow comrades in arms. Back in 1798, Admiral Nelson said that after the Battle of the Nile, I had the happiness to command a band of brothers. But the original use of that term, band of brothers, goes right back to William Shakespeare. You might be familiar with the speech that Henry V delivered before the Battle of Agincourt, and he said this: "And Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers." Now I wonder, if you had to gather around you a band of brothers, fellow warriors, to serve with you, I wonder what kind of people you would choose. Well, if we look in 1 Samuel chapter 22, we read how David, during this time when he was on the run, gathered around him a group of people. And in 1 Samuel 22 verses 1 and 2 we read this: "David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. And all of those who were in distress, in debt, or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader." Let's just read again the description of this band of brothers who gathered around David. It was all those who were in distress, all those who were in debt, all those who were discontented gathered around him. That's quite a motley crew, isn't it? And I can imagine some of the stimulating conversation and times they must have had hiding in a damp, dark cave. However, if we continue to read the story, as it unfolds, we see that many of these unlikely travelling companions, this unusual group of band of brothers, experienced what you could call a warrior masterclass from David. And in 2 Samuel chapter 23, this group of distressed, death-ridden, discontented men are described as David's fighting men. And that's quite a turnaround, to say the least. Now, these malcontents had obviously been transformed into what you would call seasoned warriors, capable of taking on overwhelming odds and winning. They were now courageous leaders with whom David not only entrusted his own personal well-being, but entrusted to them the well-being of the people who followed him. I wonder, what are some of the strengths, do you think, that we gain from serving as part of a team rather than just serving on our own? Well, we'll have a look at that a bit more later. But let's have a look at one of David's band of warriors. His name is Shammah. And he made a lone stand, we're told, in the middle of a field of lentils after the rest of the Israelite troops had fled. The Philistines, Israel's natural enemies, were attacking, and they wanted to take that field. Shammah had another idea. He stood his ground in front of the Philistines, and he brought about a great victory. He struck down the Philistines. 2 Samuel 23 verses 11 and 12 tells us about it. One writer, Rob Harley, says this: "Clearly men with sad hearts got round a man with a big heart, and they emerged from their apprenticeship, mightily charged, mightily changed, and with impressive credentials." And so the extent of the devoted brotherhood shared between David and his mighty men was graphically shown later on when David once longed for a piece of home, if you like. He wanted some assurance of the things he had left behind. And he says in 2 Samuel chapter 23 verse 15, "Oh, that someone would get me a drink of water from the well near the gate of Bethlehem." It was probably just a thing he said, looking back nostalgically to the things of home. But 3 of his loyal officers took this plea literally, and they risked their lives to cross through the enemy lines and fetch David some water from Bethlehem. David was so moved by their courage and devotion that he did not drink the water, but rather poured it out as an offering of worship to God, because only the Lord, he thought, was worthy of such great self-sacrifice. Now think of that episode of this risk-taking group of men who did all of this just for David. What does it teach us about David? What does it teach us about his fellow officers? Well, the idea of a band of brothers is that they are a fighting unit. Not just a group of people brought together, but a group of people who can do warfare together. And as God's people, as Christians, we're called into this great spiritual conflict. And we are called to serve together as a team, as a fighting unit. I want us now to have a look at a passage in the Old Testament, at the book of Ecclesiastes. And again, these words may be familiar to you, but let's see what God can teach us from them this morning. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 4. We're just going to read verses 9 through to verse 12. But if you want to read the rest of the chapter, please do sometime today. Chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes, verse 9. It says, "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labour. And if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls, who has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken." And the Lord bless his word again to us this morning. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the writer takes a hard and long look at life under the sun, as he calls it, and sees most of it as quite meaningless. It could be seen as quite a negative book. However, as he looks at the world and takes stock of it as he sees it, his conclusion is that only faith in a sovereign God is the remedy to the meaninglessness of life. And that's still the same today. Much of what we see in the world today and look at in our society and culture seems quite meaningless, really. But we know that the answer, the remedy, the solution to such a malaise is faith in a sovereign God. Now, on a number of occasions I've used this passage from Ecclesiastes 4 at weddings as a text, because it extols the virtue of living and serving together in the kingdom of God in close partnership. It also highlights the strengths and the encouragements we gain when we stand and fight shoulder to shoulder with others for Christ. Now, when Jesus sent out the 72 disciples, he sent them out in twos. We can read that in Luke chapter 10, verse 1. So what does that verse from Luke's Gospel And the verses we've just read in Ecclesiastes teach us about the benefits of serving alongside others rather than, again, as a lone ranger on our own. Even the Lone Ranger had Tonto after all. Well, let's have a look at that passage from Ecclesiastes 4 a little closer. The first thing we note is it says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their work. And this tells us that when we work together with a band of brothers, with one another as a team, we work far more efficiently. Companionship is a real blessing. And it's a powerful antidote to the isolation and loneliness that many experience. At the moment, we're forced into isolation, unfortunately, and if we haven't got a partner or members of the family living with us, then it can seem very lonely. Imagine that loneliness when you're taking big decisions and taking responsibility in a time of conflict. So it's good to work with others. It gives us far more confidence, if you like, and enables us to serve far more effectively. I'm sure that when we can each recall a difficult job or a difficult circumstance that we faced, we've realised that those difficult things can be made far easier in the presence of another person who stands with us or works alongside us. And now God's most powerful weapon on the earth is his church. And if this is a company of redeemed hearts, as I believe it is, then this regiment, if you like, of faithful servants of Christ that God has ordained to impact his world with his love and his grace, then there's a supernatural synergy of bringing together whereby there is far more effective power in us as a group than there is in each one of us as individuals. We stand together to advance the gospel. So when we work as part of a team, we work far more efficiently. But let's have a look further. Verse 10 says, if one falls down, his friend can help him up, but pity the man who falls down and has no one to help him up. Now, sometimes in situations I've been in industry, the question was when someone left the company, did he jump or did he fall? Well, whatever the answer is, that person ended up down, if you like. And if we fall, as we will in our lives, and we're alone, it can prove not only painful, but sometimes fatal. But one who knows close companionship, good friendship, good teamwork, will always have the reassurance that if they fall, and when they fall, someone is standing by who will lift them up and carry them to safety. Back in 2005, a young private named Johnson B. Harry was awarded the first Victoria Cross for over 20 years for gallant service in the conflict in Iraq. The opening words of his citation say this: Private B. Harry carried out two individual acts of great heroism by which he saved the lives of his comrades. Both were in direct face of the enemy under intense fire at great personal risk to himself, one leading him to sustain very serious injuries. His valour is worthy of the highest recognition. You see, when those soldiers were injured and went down, had they been on their own, they may have survived, but more than likely would have bled out, would have died. But you see, Johnson B. Harry was there as part of the team with his band of brothers, and he was there to rescue them, and deservedly won the Victoria Cross. So when we work as a team, as a band of brothers, not only can we work and serve far more efficiently, we can walk and serve more securely because we know there are others there to pick us up when we fall. Verse 11 goes on to say this: Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But who can keep warm on their own? Now, at times of adversity, temptation and grief, a cold wind can blow, a wind that chills us and we feel cold and miserable. And sometimes our love for God and even the love for the church can grow cold. And again, isolation only serves to reinforce this spiritual cold spell. Many times I've heard people who say they're going through a difficult time, therefore they're going to step back from church. I understand how that feels, but they're actually robbing themselves from the support and encouragement and the security that being part of the fellowship of the church brings to them. To describe this, it's a bit of a fun story. There was once a group of porcupines, and they were settling down for the night in a wooded area, and it was a severe cold winter's night, and they were desperately cold. So they had to find some way of keeping warm, or in the morning, most of them would never wake up. So they decided to take desperate measures, and when the morning light came, all of the porcupines were alive except for one. You see, the night before, the porcupines had decided to huddle together. Now, being a porcupine, huddling together with another porcupine is going to be a painful situation. The effects of cuddling together were immediate. Boy, was it painful. But the one porcupine didn't want that pain, and so didn't cuddle up into that close fellowship. And so he died. He paid the price. Yep, fellowship can be painful sometimes. It can be difficult. But if we don't gather together as God's people and stay out on our own, then we will spiritually die. So moving on again. In verse 12 it says, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. Now there is safety in numbers, there's no doubt about that. One of the tactics of our enemy, the devil, is to pick off stragglers, the loners, the people who break formation or lag behind at the rear of the column, if you like. He loves people that want to do it on their own, who think they know better, who've reached some higher plane than others. He loves people who isolate themselves, who don't mix, that don't join in, because when they're on their own, they're such easy people to pick off and affect. You see, when we conduct warfare together as God's people, we do it far more effectively when we're part of a band of brothers, when we serve together with one another. In the Air Force, this is a known situation. Talking about fighter pilots, for instance, when fighter pilots go up to engage the enemy, they always have a wingman, and they rely on the skill that the wingman brings. What a wingman does is he is a pilot in another plane who flies slightly behind and to one side of the other aeroplane. In other words, to watch his tail, because fighter jets are still susceptible to attack from behind. So they have someone just behind them keeping an eye on the enemy coming up behind. As Christians, we need that kind of friendship too. Someone who's watching our back, who's got our back, who's keeping an eye on the enemy who comes up, sometimes unseen and subtly. Someone who's there for us, whatever the circumstance. And a big Air Force base in California, one of the commanders there, Colonel Steve Tanous, explained what he meant by the wingman ethos in the men that he served with. He says, airmen are helping airmen, and being a wingman calls for building relationships, caring about our fellow airmen, and getting to know them enough to recognize when they need our help and support, or in some cases our intervention. Now you may ask, he says, why this is important. It's important, he says, because each of us is as important to the mission as the other. No one is more special than the other, and the impact of what we do together extends far and wide. We need each other, and we need those close friends, those wingmen and women who are watching our backs. We each need to have someone who we can rely on, someone who we know, and that despite the conflict and the warfare spiritually that may rage around us, we know that they are there for us and with us, keeping a watchful eye on the situation, keeping a watchful eye on us. Now, going back to VE Day, the goal of Adolf Hitler's Nazi war machine was to dominate Europe, to create what he called Lebensraum, that's living space, where through him the superior Aryan race would control every aspect of people's lives, as it did in Germany, and of course sadly exterminate anyone who he regarded as inferior. And millions were exterminated just because they didn't fit the Aryan idea of race and of people. Now, as Christians, we're engaged in a war where each one of us has a part to play. No one is more special than the other. We're each servants of God. But the prize, the goal that we are engaged in this warfare, is far greater than even that of peace in Europe. You see, we're involved in a conflict that's not concerned about gaining ground or imposing an ideology or dominance over others. We're involved with the eternal destiny of human souls. There's no greater cause. Let's think about that. The warfare we are engaged in each day concerns ultimately the eternal destiny of human souls. That's sobering. That reminds us of all that's going on at the moment. And as I've said before, for all the help and care and compassion and love that we show to others, which is so right and good, we must be aware that these people, many of them, still are not saved. And if they're not saved, they're lost. There's no middle ground. There's no fence to sit upon. It's about eternal souls and where those souls will spend eternity. The Apostle Paul, when he wrote to the church in Rome, instructed them in how they should live their lives within the wider society and spoke about that great day that was coming. And he says in the book of Romans chapter 13 and verses 11 and 12, "And do this," he says, "understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside those deeds of darkness and put on the armour of light." These are powerful words to bring this morning's message to a close. What was Paul reminding those early believers of? Well, he says that we must understand the present time. It is a strange time that we're all in at the moment. But even before coronavirus struck and the lockdown was put into effect and all of those changes took place, this world was in a sad condition in many ways, infected not so much by a virus like the COVID-19, but infected by a virus of indifference, of uncaring, of selfishness. So therefore the work was always there for us to do. The battle was always on for us who serve Christ. But we need to understand the present time. Let's take time this week to pray and ask God to give us insight into what this present time is telling us and showing us, so that we may be addressing the issues that are there, fighting in the right place, on the right battlefield. Otherwise we waste our energy, our time, even our finances as church, serving where God is not already working. The Apostle Paul says the hour has come for us to wake up from our slumber. When we're asleep, we're just unaware of what's going on around us and uninvolved. And maybe some of us have grown sleepy. As Christians, we are unaware of what's going on around us and uninvolved. Some churches too have kind of semi-comatized. They go through what they do and they carry on with what they're doing and they're just thanking God they're still there, but they're not aware of what's going on around them or engaged. We need to understand the present time and wake up from our slumber, Paul says, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. Whenever we first believed in Jesus, no matter how many years or even months or weeks ago, our salvation, the completion of our salvation, the finishing of that work of salvation is now far nearer than it was then. In other words, Christ is coming back to bring all things to a close, to take to be with him those who love him and know him, and to leave those behind to receive their judgment. With that, again, sobering thought in mind, we need to wake up from our slumber, because salvation is nearer now than it was when we first believed. The night is nearly over, Paul says. Now we know that this is some many thousands of years ago that Paul wrote this to the church in Rome. But God is not slow, the Bible tells us, in acting, in responding. He is patient, wanting none to perish, all to be saved. The night is nearly over, Paul says, and the day is almost here. The day of Christ's return is almost here. He's on the way, brothers and sisters, and we need to be about our Father's business until he comes. And I pray for myself personally that when Jesus comes, he will find me serving and not find me sleeping. So he says to the church in Rome, let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armour of light. You only need to put on the armour if you're going to engage in battle. Otherwise it seems heavy and cumbersome and unnecessary. But in battle it's essential and can save our lives. I pray that as we engage in spiritual warfare, as we go out into God's world, even with limited effect at the moment, the conversations we have, the people we write to or speak to on the phone, or the people we video conference, that we might have the courage in these dark days, because the day is coming, to put on the armour of light and dispel the darkness. The good news is, brothers and sisters, this Sunday morning, no matter how great the darkness is, it can never dispel the light. And even the smallest light, even the smallest flickering candle flame, can dispel the darkness. You may seem or feel small. You may feel that you're just a little candle amongst a vast darkness. But that darkness will never overwhelm you. But you can dispel the darkness. The Lord bless you and keep you. Thank you so much for listening this morning. And I pray this message has been an encouragement to you. And until we meet again, God bless you and keep you safe and well. Amen.